Buonasera, anzi buon pomeriggio a tutti. Grazie per essere intervenuti a questa riunione della nostra Accademia delle Scienze, che è dedicata a un tema sempre attuale, che è quello del Covid. E ne parliamo oggi con alcuni esperti, fra cui il professor A.IOANNIDIS, che qui saluto e ringrazio per essere intervenuto, e il professor POWIS, che è collegato da lontano, più altri relatori come il professor MANZOLI e il professor VIALE, che sono già intervenuti a una riunione che facemmo sul Covid, fra le tante che sono state fatte, in occasione del Festival della Scienza Medica del 2021, quando eravamo in piena pandemia, tant'è vero che quella riunione fatta nell'ottobre-novembre del 21 fu fatta a porte chiuse con migliaia di collegamenti da tutte le parti del mondo, perché eravamo ancora in un'epoca nella quale non si potevano fare riunioni in presenza. Questa è la prima riunione che noi personalmente organizziamo dopo la cessazione ufficiale della pandemia ed è un'occasione per rimeditare a distanza di tempo, quando finalmente numerosi dati sono stati accumulati. Voi che seguite la letteratura scientifica potete constatare come la letteratura sul Covid è tuttora molto, molto ricca. È chiaro che quello che noi abbiamo imparato è molto, però è ancora poco rispetto a quello che dovremmo sapere. Però, a 2 anni di distanza, l'occasione per rimeditare su alcune problematiche che all'epoca erano state poste, forse da alcuni risolte in maniera molto semplicistica, possono essere rivisitate con molta più esperienza, molta più conoscenza. Pertanto ringrazio il professor COCCO che ha organizzato questo incontro, i relatori che sono intervenuti, voi che siete qui presenti e vi auguro buon lavoro. Welcome Professor A.IOANNIDIS to Bologna again. Welcome Professor POWIS, even though from United Kingdom, and I wish you a fruitful work today. Prego, Lucio.
Given that this afternoon is up to me to chair this symposium, just allow me to use the language of science, which is English. You know, Italian is useless for this point of view, as well as Greek. John, allow me to make this joke. And just very short notice to the speakers. You know, just making the program, we have about 30 minutes of time allotted for each of you, and after that a few minutes of questions, if there are. I hope that they will. And it's now my pleasure to introduce the first speaker, Professor Steve in a very familiar way, POWIS. But I should add one thing. Not still professor, but now Sir Stephen POWIS. He was knighted by the Queen just last year, so it's something that, you know, we have had a lot of sirs here belonging to Academy. The last one who has been accepted here was Sir Tim Hunt, a Nobel Prize. So could be next year, Steve, we can fight for you. So thanking again for staying with us, even though in remote. I ask you to start with your presentation. Thank you.
Thanks, Lucio, and I hope you can all hear me. And good afternoon, everybody. It's a real pleasure. I wish I could be with you in Bologna. I've just looked at your local weather forecast. It looks as if it's 26 degrees and sunny in Bologna. Unfortunately, here in London, as I look beyond my computer screen out the window, it's 16 degrees and miserable. So I know I would much rather be with you in Italy, but I'm not. I'm here in London. And as Lucio said, I've got half an hour. So within half an hour, and because I'm the first speaker, I'm going to give you a fairly high-level view of the pandemic. And I'm going to particularly focus on the way it evolved here in the United Kingdom and some of the things that we did in the UK. Clearly, that will be reflected in similar approaches in many countries around the world, including Italy. And then I'm going to give you a few personal reflections on what it felt like to be a senior medical leader managing the pandemic, and then finally some thoughts on reflections and learning points and things that we need to think about in advance of the next pandemic, because of course there will be one. And of course that means that, to start with, I must remind everybody, I'm sure you don't need reminded, that pandemics are nothing new. We have seen many in the past, and we will see them again. And as I'm in London, I thought we'd start with a little bit of history from London in terms of how Londoners have managed over the centuries. And as I often say in speeches I give here, outbreaks, plagues, epidemics, pandemics, Londoners have seen all of them, as I know every European city has done, including Bologna. So plague first came to London in 1348. And it returned frequently over the next 3 centuries. And during the bad years of the Black Death, as you know, it became known, it's estimated to have killed up to 1/4 of the population of London. And you can see the first slide I've got in front of you is the depiction of a Black Death doctor that you will be very familiar with. And that instantly recognized masked beak, allegedly, is said to have contained mixtures of plants and herbs that were thought to ward off infection. So one of the first examples of personal protective equipment, PPE, if you want. Now, by the 1980s, London had become the largest city in the world, and its overcrowded slums and buildings inevitably meant more infection. And in 1831, a terrifying new epidemic arrived here in the city, cholera, bringing with it fear and panic. And it was quickly followed by epidemics of influenza and typhoid, prompting the government halfway through the 19th century to carry out an urgent review into the city's sanitation. And of course, in the Great War in 1918, just as the Great War ended, the city was struck by the Great Spanish Flu pandemic, killing over 18,000 Londoners. But the good news is, throughout that, London, like most cities, have learned how to cope with pandemics and epidemics. And there are some particular things that happened here in London that I think it's always worth remembering. So in 1796, the pioneering work of Edward Jenner, who was trained just a few miles down the road from where I am at St. George's Hospital, led, of course, the first widespread use of vaccination. And in this city, in London, it was first implemented against smallpox in the 19th century. A few miles that way, in Soho, in 1854, John Snow showed that cholera was an infection spread not through the air, but by contaminated drinking water. And he did that through a set of meticulous work linking drinking to a public water pump in Soho, in the centre of London. And of course, that work formed the basis of the science that we now recognise as epidemiology. And a few further miles away from where I am at the moment, at St. Mary's Hospital in 1928, it was Alexander Fleming who noticed a fungus mould on his laboratory bench was killing the bacteria he'd left in culture. And that, of course, that chance observation, that serendipitous observation, marked the discovery of antibiotics. So pandemics, epidemics are not new, and we have learned over the years how to manage them and cope with them. And scientific advances have no doubt proved critical in that progress. And that is exactly the same during the COVID-19 pandemic, as I'll come back to later. So let me now give you an overview of the pandemic from the perspective of the UK. And to do this, I'm going to use data that's freely available on the UK government's pandemic web pages. And I'm going to use data from the period from the beginning of March 2020 through to the summer of 2022, so a year ago. A little bit later in the talk, I'll bring you up to date over the past year, but this is the core period of the pandemic that I think is worthy of consideration today. So what you see in front of you is a series of graphs showing the number of cases of COVID-19 at the top, the patients in hospitals. This is English data rather than the whole of the UK, but it would have followed a similar pattern if you include the whole of the UK. Patients in mechanical ventilator beds, i.e. the sickest patients, and then deaths as recorded within 28 days of a COVID positive test. And in the analysis I'm going to make today, I'm going to split this time frame into 3 distinct periods. And the first period occurred between March and December 2020. Now, of course, it's important from the outset to point out that there was a period prior to March 2020 where the first cases occurred in Wuhan in China and then began to spread and be detected in other countries around the world. And I will remind you that the World Health Organization declared COVID-19 a fake, a public health emergency of international concern on the 30th of January 2020. And that was exactly the time here in England that NHS England, the organization I work for as National Medical Director and oversees the health service in England, moved to its highest level of incident response, declared a level 4 incident, reflecting the gravity of the developing global health emergency. So before the first case had been detected in the UK, we had already moved into a high level of incident response and a command and control structure. So the first cases of COVID in the UK were identified around that time, the end of January, and the first COVID-related death occurred on the 5th of March, just over a couple of months later. Now, in the NHS in England, our focus during that time before March 2020 was to support the repatriation of UK citizens from countries with COVID infections, China, Japan, standing up public advice on COVID through our systems that we use to inform the public, supporting the many hospitals and organizations within the national health system to prepare as infections began to emerge in the UK, and planning on how we could expand our bed capacity and overall capacity to deal with what we anticipated would be a surge in cases. And of course, during that period, knowledge of the new virus was rapidly evolving. Worth, of course, making the point that you all know that although we know a certain amount about coronaviruses, this was a new virus, and its clinical course, its impact was unknown, and knowledge of that was still in its early stages in those first few months of 2020. But again, as you all know, by the beginning of March, it was becoming increasingly clear that the impact that COVID-19 would have on health systems throughout the world and here in the UK was going to be quite dramatic and quite impactful. So the scale of the potential problem can be seen in this piece of work that was done here by the Scientific Advisory Group on Emergencies, SAGE, which is the UK government body that advises the government on scientific issues in a range of emergencies, of which this particular one, of course, was COVID-19. And these are the inputs. You may not be able to read them, I'm sure, in the hall, but these are the inputs into a reasonable worst case scenario. So the sort of assumptions that were being made around the end of February, beginning of March 2020, based on the knowledge that had emerged at the time as to what the impact of COVID-19 might be in the UK. Now, from these sort of input assumptions, you can do modelling. I'm not a modeller, and I wouldn't claim to have expertise in modelling, but I don't think you need to be a modeller to take the sort of data that you can see here and work out what the potential impact might be. So the population of England is around 56 million people. And in these assumptions, agreed by consensus with scientific advisors here in the UK, you could see that this is making assumptions around an infection attack rate of 80%, meaning that 80% of the population would be infected during an initial wave, which means 45 million of the English population would become infected. The assumption here is that the infection fatality rate is 1% of all infections, and you can see an age distribution there. But if you take the 1% of all infections, 1% of 45 million is 450,000. So on this set of assumptions, 450,000 might die. And if you make a reasonable assumption that those patients will all require hospital care, and of those that die, and hospital mortality would be 25%, that means around 1.8 million admissions into hospitals. And with half the cases predicted to occur in a peak 3-week period during an initial wave, that translates to an average of around 300,000 admissions into hospitals that week. Now, there are only 100,000 hospital beds acute hospital beds in the NHS in England, of which around 2,000 under normal circumstances are critical care beds. So in my mind, the question was never that left unmitigated in this sort of reasonable worst case scenario, the NHS, the health system here, would have become overwhelmed. The question was whether the pandemic would indeed follow the course of that particular worst case scenario, and that the assumptions that were driving the worst case scenario you can see depicted here were actually correct assumptions, or whether indeed there was some flaw in the assumptions, something that we didn't know, and the assumptions might be different and therefore the impact less. Now, unfortunately, at the time, the evidence from other countries, and you'll be very familiar from these pictures from Northern Italy, was that left unmitigated, when infections had not been detected, then health systems were rapidly becoming overwhelmed. So without interventions to reduce the spread between individuals, health systems were unable to cope. Now, our modelers, of course, were able to use much more sophisticated analyses to translate the assumptions I've just shown you into epidemic predictions, epidemic curves. But more importantly, they were also able to begin to model the mitigating impact of what became known as, variety of terms for this, but these are non-pharmaceutical interventions. These are the variety of interventions that, when put together, variously got known as lockdown. And of course, lockdown means different things in different countries and different time periods, but essentially they are a lockdown is a combination of social distancing measures, non-pharmaceutical interventions. And you can see the modelling here from Imperial College in London. The Imperial team here in London were perhaps one of the more prominent groups of modellers at the time in early March 2020. And this is taken again from papers that went to SAGE, that advisory group, in early 2020. And it shows the potential effect that various NPIs might have on critical care occupancy. And you can see that depending on the measure, you have different impacts, and putting those impacts together, you begin to have quite significant mitigating impacts against the effects of the pandemic, not just in mortality, of course, not shown here, but in the impact on health services. Now, as you all know, in the UK and of course in other countries, including Italy, a range of these social distancing measures, these non-pharmaceutical interventions, were progressively introduced. And in the UK, that culminated in what became referred to as full lockdown, the full combination of those measures on March the 26th, 2020. And of course, although the do-nothing approach was never allowed to happen, and although models such as this have subsequently become the subject of quite a bit of debate, my own view is that I never had any reason to doubt that without the introduction of social distancing, something similar to the impact that we saw in that worst case scenario would have occurred, and it would have been incredibly difficult for the health system in the UK to deal with the number of cases that would likely have resulted in the need for hospitalization. Now, of course, subsequent analyses, such as this one, actually taken from the Financial Times, have been running good series of articles on this over the years, have suggested that the actual infection fatality rates were not too different, as it turned out, from those suggested by that initial set of assumptions in that reasonable worst case scenario that I showed you. So, of course, those lockdown measures, those NPIs, spread the impact rather than in themselves reduce the overall infection fatality rate. So this first phase of the pandemic is the phase in which, in the absence of any specific COVID therapeutics, the spread of infection could only be managed by, in some respects, a century-old approach or centuries-old approach of reducing social contacting. Quarantining has been with us for many, many years. So this is the period where the pandemic was managed solely by non-pharmaceutical interventions. Now, it's worth pointing out a few other characteristics of that phase. Firstly, because community testing capacity was limited, and it wasn't just limited in this country, it was limited in many other countries, as capacity was built up, as supply chain constraints, when everybody was looking for the same set of reagents around the world, they started to ease. But in this first phase, the course of the pandemic largely had to be tracked by the volume of hospital cases. And you will see in the graphs that the number of hospital cases is the more accurate depiction of the pandemic compared to the number of cases, because the testing capacity in this phase was limited. As we got further into that period, testing capacity increased, and therefore you can see that in that period. But we were very reliant on hospital cases. And of course, hospital cases is lag data. It is telling you what's happened in the community 2 weeks ago, because it takes around 2 weeks for somebody to become infected, become ill enough to arrive in hospital. So it's looking backwards rather than anticipating what might happen over the next few weeks. Secondly, the number of deaths was high, and you can see that in the bottom graph. And thirdly, and that's in contrast to the latter phases, the impact on critical care was immense. So most of the pressure that we felt here in that first wave was on our critical care capacity. We were able to manage our general bed capacity, our non-critical care capacity, by managing to increase it, but also to discharge patients who were medically fit. But the pressure here was on critical care, and it was not only on ventilator capacity, it was on some of the consumables. So consumables that were needed, for instance, for dialysis treatment, for anesthetic management, anesthetic drugs, for instance, became quite critical in their supply. So a lot of critical supply issues in this first phase. Now, it's also worth remembering that in later phases of the pandemic, in my opinion, modelling became harder. And back to the debate around modelling. Why? Well, because there were more variables to take into account, such as new variants, such as waning immunity, such as different levels of vaccine uptake once we got into the vaccine program. And as an illustration of that, here is another paper from SAGE, another modelling paper that was considered, this time skipping a bit ahead in the summer of 2021. And the point about this is that this set of modelling predicted that there would be quite a significant wave of COVID and in hospital cases in August 2021. And this was following a planned removal in many of the social distancing measures that were in place legally in the United Kingdom at the time. Now, in the event, the cases didn't rise to the level that were predicted in these models. It really points to the fact that, as everybody who uses models knows, that models are a prediction of what might happen, or a set of scenarios about what might happen. They are not actually what can happen. And this is one set of models. There were others, and it's always valuable. The more models that you can look at, the more valuable they are. Simply looking at a single model is less valuable. Anyhow, we'll come back to modeling later. Now, let's move on to the second phase of the pandemic. Here I've marked it here on these charts. So for us, I think this is, I've marked this from December the 8th, 2021, and it lasted until February 23rd, 2022. So why that early date in December? Well, because that is when Maggie Keenan, a patient in Coventry in the Midlands in England, became the first person in the world to be vaccinated with a COVID vaccine outside of a clinical trial. So in my mind, that marks the point at which the approach to managing the pandemic truly began to shift from simply non-pharmaceutical interventions, social distancing measures, through to COVID therapeutics. And I think if you'd asked any of us in March 2020, whether COVID vaccines would be developed, tested in clinical trials, approved by regulators, and introduced into practice within 9 months of the initial impact of the pandemic, we'd have said that was highly improbable. But it happened, and it happened through a huge collective scientific evidence effort throughout the world, and of course based on years of research into mRNA, into adenoviral vaccines that had come to fruition just at the time that the world needed them in order to rapidly develop those vaccines. And of course, the recent award of this year's Nobel Prize recognizes some of the science that went into the work that led us to produce those vaccines in such record time. And the vaccines are proven highly effective, especially at preventing severe disease, hospitalization. That's their main benefit. And again, once again, this can be shown Here in this set of data from the Financial Times, it's a couple of years out of date now, but it shows the impact, the efficacy these vaccines have had against symptomatic infection, and against hospitalization. And they really had and continue to have quite a marked impact. The UK vaccine program was a huge success, and probably just be worth me spending a few moments on thinking why, reflecting with you why I think it was a success. So first, here in the UK, a vaccine task force was established very, very early on, partially independent from governments, and with the task of supporting the development and the early procurement of multiple different vaccines. And that was a highly successful approach. Secondly, rapid establishment of clinical trials to test vaccines in this country and others meant the efficacy of vaccines could be quickly determined. Thirdly, regulators, and here in the UK, that's the MHRA, worked closely with manufacturers throughout the development to ensure that licenses could be granted as quickly as possible. Fourthly, here in the UK, the body that recommends vaccine approaches to the government, i.e. who should get the vaccines, in what order they should be deployed, the Joint Committee on Vaccines and Immunizations here in the UK recommended a risk-based stepwise approach. In other words, vaccinate the most at risk first. So that for us was the over 80s, people in care homes, people on immunosuppression, and then stepwise make the vaccines available to lower risk groups coming down the ages. And that was highly successful. It meant that the public got into the rhythm of waiting for their particular cohort to be called. It wasn't free for all for everybody. It meant that the highest risk patients were protected first. And finally, the National Health Service here maximised its ability as a very coordinated health system to put in place a programme at pace and at scale very rapidly. And that worked very well. There was great flexibility. Adjustments were made, and we got a high rate of vaccination very early on. And again, as you can see in this graph, first dose, second dose, and booster dose, we really had very sharp uptake, very rapid uptake of vaccines in our population. Now, of course, during this period, drug treatments also became available. And the rapid stand-up of clinical trials, again, has been one of the great success stories of the pandemic. In the UK, the recovery trial, other similar studies identified effective COVID treatments, initially, of course, based on repurposing of existing drugs such as dexamethasone. But just as importantly, those studies showed what treatments didn't work. Quite correctly, in an emergency, COVID therapies have been procured and introduced early, especially in high-risk groups, and sometimes without the usual rigorous cost-effectiveness appraisals that we would do in the UK. But nevertheless, in an emergency, it's important that we get drugs to people as quickly as possible. And here in the UK, as I'm sure in Italy, we started the rollout of specific COVID drugs nearly 2 years ago now. This is one of them, Paxlovid, rolled out into community settings. And of course, these oral preparations are another step change in the management of the pandemic. But we also continue to couple that with a really strict and rigorous evidence-based approach. So at the same time that these drugs were rolled out into the community, they were rolled out through clinical trials. So the panoramic trial, which is looking at molnupiravir, has looked at molnupiravir and Paxlovid in community settings outside of hospitals, have been some of the largest primary care studies that we have ever performed. And again, the public have joined in and volunteered for these studies. So the second phase of the pandemic is that transition period where we are now moving to measures other than social distancing. Population immunity is growing through vaccination, natural infections. Community testing is now widespread. You can see that in the testing graph, that the testing is now mirroring the hospital cases. And throughout, of course, this time, the virus is mutating. So the early vaccine program couldn't prevent that alpha wave that you see in January 2021. Lockdown again required then. But by the autumn of 2021, towards the end of this period, infections are not beginning to reach the level in terms of hospital cases that they had reached in prior waves. So immunity, vaccination, and COVID therapeutics are beginning to impact on the number of hospitalizations. So let's move to the third phase of the pandemic finally. And I commenced this in the UK on February the 24th, 2022. And the reason for that is the date when all remaining lockdown restrictions in England were removed. And in the words of the Prime Minister at the time here, we begin to learn to live with this virus and continue protecting ourselves without restricting freedoms. And so in this phase, societies gradually return towards pre-pandemic levels of activity and social contact, and the health system has had to begin to fully cope with the pandemic in the absence of social distancing. On the positive side, COVID is less severe. You can see that now, a much lower proportion of patients requiring critical care. Immunity and new therapies mean the impact is much similar to flu. And the majority of patients in hospital now with COVID are not receiving treatment specifically for COVID as a primary diagnosis, as demonstrated in this data from Scotland. But increasingly, the majority of patients in hospital with COVID have COVID as an incidental finding. They're being managed for something else. But with the standing down of community testing, you can see that hospitalization again is becoming one of the lead indicators of tracking the pandemic. Now, the NHS has come under significant pressure as we come out of the pandemic. You can see this in the chart here. This is ambulance response times, and you can see our ambulance response times as we went through last year. They've recovered this year, but last year response times were not as good as they should be. And that was because as emergency work came back, as society opened up again, we began to see a lot of pressure on health systems. And so recovery pandemic has been challenging, and we've had to put in particular measures to address that. We have long waiting lists for elective care, again, because of the disruption that we saw during the pandemic. And it is quite a challenge to get back on top of that. You can see that this, again, data from going into 2022, how our waiting lists for treatment rose post-pandemic. And COVID, of course, has not yet become seasonable. And you can see in the period that I'm highlighting here, the third phase, those waves of COVID that we saw during 2022. Few personal reflections before I finish, just coming up to the end, Lucio. Few other things just to think about during the pandemic. So firstly, it was a period when clinicians, scientists were thrust into the public limelight, into public debate in a way that I certainly can't remember over my career. So you can see, here's a picture of me with the Prime Minister at the time and Jonathan Van Tam, Deputy Chief Medical Officer, giving one of the regular live press conference briefings from Downing Street. And I did about 35 of these during the course of the pandemic and beyond. And at its peak, millions and millions of people in the UK were tuning in to these live press conferences to hear the politicians, but probably just as importantly, more importantly, listening to the scientists and clinicians telling them how the disease was evolving, how the vaccine program was going, what the NHS was doing to cope with demand. And I think these were really important public messaging. I got depicted in a drama on television. I haven't had that before. You can see the person playing me, Simon Trevor's an actor. Very interesting watching yourself being portrayed on television in a part fictional docudrama. But I have to say, being a celebrity is interesting, but I wouldn't necessarily recommend it full time. Best to be a clinician and scientist behind the scenes. And of course, I had some real personal moments to remember. So this is a photograph I took of Maggie Keenan in Coventry getting that first vaccine. And it was a real honor and privilege to be in the hospital to witness that. And indeed, one of the things that I did afterwards was to bring that very first vial back from Coventry. And you can see here I am holding it as I handed it over to the Science Museum in London. This is the Pfizer vaccine, the vial where the very first vaccine to ever be given outside a clinical trial. That's where the dose was taken from. I brought back the needle and syringe as well. And you can see here they are in the Science Museum in London. If you visit London, you will see the vaccine display. And there is the vial and the needle. So these are real personal memories for me that I get a little bit emotional about it sometimes when I look back. Of course, the virus is mutating. You all know that. The pandemic still having its impact. We're now mostly seeing variants of Omicron. To bring you up to date, this is data as of this week, and you can see at the right-hand end, hospital cases in the UK, in England here, sorry, are not at the levels that they were last year. We see those waves that occurred last year. We had about 5 waves. This year, we've seen a steady decline into the summer, and we're just seeing hospital cases increasing as we come into our autumn and winter. So we have about 4,000 patients in English hospitals with COVID as I speak to you today. We had about 1,000 at the beginning of July, which was the smallest number we had this year. We are now in the period of reflecting on what we've learned from the pandemic, and the chief medical officers and myself, some of the other chief scientific advisors, published a technical report at the end of last year. You can search for it online. It's a very long document that lays out what we have learned from the pandemic as a sort of report to be used by future chief medical officers for the next pandemic. It's our reflections on how the pandemic was handled from a scientific and clinical point of view, and a set of lessons for the future. And of course, in the UK, there is a legal public inquiry into COVID-19, which is currently ongoing. Indeed, today, one of the foremost modelers is getting evidence. I was watching that a little bit earlier. Those public hearings are going on at the moment, and the purpose of this inquiry is to come up with a set of formal recommendations for government that can be taken into the next pandemic. Final slide, few reflections on what we've learned, the things that we should be discussing. It's not an exhaustive list, but these are some of the things that I think we have learned about and we need to reflect on to plan for the next pandemic. I've mentioned modelling. Modelling has been at times controversial. Its limitations, I think, are known to those of us that deal with models a lot. But nevertheless, it can be incredibly useful. So there is a debate to be had about types of modelling, about how modelling is used. Data. Flows of data are really important. And in the UK, data around vaccine uptake, data about therapeutics uptake, lots of data sources, data about hospital admissions. Using all of that data together gives you real insight as to how the pandemic is developing, but also where to target your response. And that's really important, and when to target your response. Talked about the use of lockdowns. All countries had some form of social distancing, some legal, implemented through legal routes, others such as Sweden, you could argue through much more cultural approaches. Working out what works best and which components of lockdowns, because as I said, they're all made up of a variety of different social distancing measures, school closures, banning of big events, mask wearing, keeping people apart in terms of guidance on meterage, which of those are most effective. And of course, they all have disbenefits. Closed schools, there are educational disbenefits, and weighing up that, I think, will be something important for the future. How we protect our vulnerable groups, people who are immunosuppressed, people with cancer, people in care homes, is a really important thing to think about. Health inequalities. COVID exposed existing health inequalities. It affected some members of our society more than others, and how we address that, how we plan for that is going to be important. Talked about the value of large-scale research and setting that up at pace. How can we take that post-pandemic, the momentum that we got from that? What can we learn from it? Because I think we'd all agree the faster and the better research we can do, the more we're going to make rapid medical progress. Vaccine innovations I've talked about. First deployment of mRNA and adenoviral vaccines at large scale, a really significant moment, all the way back to Jenna, mentioned at the start, all the way through to the latest vaccine innovations. And we need more innovations in vaccines in other infectious diseases. Turns out that recovering and transiting out of the pandemic is challenging. I've talked about the recovery, the backlogs that we've got to work through, but also taking away some of those COVID-specific services that we put in place. We've got specific services, for instance, to deliver COVID therapeutics. That is challenging. And moving, if you want, into a world where COVID becomes another respiratory infection occurring on a seasonal basis, that is challenging. And here, as I speak, we've got people calling for return to mask wearing as we turn into the winter, tightening up of infection prevention and control measures. So that debate still goes on, and there are still, I recognize, many people in our society who are really worried about COVID, really impacting upon their daily lives. And then finally, pandemic preparation, because there will be another one. What have we learned from this one to inform us in the handling of the next one? And of course, the final thing I'd say is, however much preparation we do, we will still have to innovate and work flexibly to manage the next pandemic. They say, I think, in military, the best laid plans or never survive first impact with the enemy. And it's absolutely true. No matter how much planning you can do, you still will not be able to have the complete response to the next pandemic. We don't know what virus it will be. We don't know what form it will take. We don't know what variant it would be. For instance, if it was flu, we don't know how it will spread. We don't know how new innovations will be deployed. We wouldn't know how the public would react if there were further lockdowns. So part of pandemic preparation is just the machinery we put in place for any instant, any emergency, irrespective of what it is. We do that here in the NHS. We're managing incidents, supply chain disruption, cyber attacks all the time. And we must never forget it's that sort of incident planning that serves us well, in addition to the specific knowledge around epidemiology and viruses and infectious diseases. With that, I'm going to end. I hope that's been a useful introduction to the afternoon. I'm sure there'll be plenty of time for discussion, and some of these points will be expanded upon by subsequent speakers, but it's been a real pleasure being with you this afternoon. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Steve, for this very interesting, but it was a highlight on the problems, and we should think a lot about the data you've shown to us. So I ask people here in the audience questions. Okay, on you go, please. John.
Stephen, thank you for a wonderful talk, and thank you for all the amazing work that you have done in the UK during the pandemic. I really enjoyed what you said with just one anomaly. I think that the slides from Financial Times actually, I think, are extremely unreliable. For example, the infection fatality rate curve is about 4 to 6 times off based on the data that we have from national seroprevalence studies. And it's also having a very weird gradient. The risk, for example, in 60 to 69, which is very close to the original Imperial College modeling, was supposed to be 2.3% risk of death. The data that we have now from 38 national seroprevalence studies from countries that have very good data is 0.5%. So this is 4 to 5 times off. And the same applies to other aspects of the Financial Times coverage. And not just the Financial Times coverage. I think that newspapers and media, and I leave aside conspiracy theories and weird people who just said all kinds of nonsense, even the serious ones were unfortunately way off. And I say this not to correct single numbers, but because it affects the overall understanding of the response to the pandemic. If the infection fatality rate was 4 times lower, and if the attack rate, not with unmitigated, because unmitigated was not an option, no one would do nothing, hearing every day, right and left, that we have a serious crisis, a serious pandemic. Everybody did something. Even Sweden did quite a bit. But let's say that this is the unmitigated. Even with that, only about 10% of the population was infected before availability of vaccines. The scenario was 8-fold off in terms of the number of people being infected, and about 4 times off in terms of the infection fatality rate. That makes 32 times off overall, because you have to multiply that. Is this something acceptable? My perspective to modeling is that it failed bitterly, including my modeling. And not that it was, well, it was okay. So I think it was really devastatingly wrong.
Well, I'm glad the debate started already. So yes, I mean, clearly you're correct that there's a range of different estimates. I use the ones that the FT had used, but point taken. But 2 points, of course. Firstly, some of that, that data becomes apparent after the event. And you can only work on the data that you have at the start. And I think that's, John, that would be an interesting one to discuss, because clearly you are never going to be in a position of hindsight at the very start. So it'd be interesting for your views on that as well when you come a bit later on. I think even if it had been several fold off, we would still have been under significant pressure. And I think the point you've made that no mitigation was not an option. I think the difficulty at the very start of this of these things is data is uncertain, and you don't have the time to wait, in a sense, to see which way it's going to go. And I think that's the crux of this, isn't it? It's how you take away the people always say the retrospectoscope is the most easily used instrument in medicine, and it's how you manage this in real time. And I think that's the challenge that we faced, and it's a challenge we'll face next time round again. But I'm glad I put modelling right at the start of my areas for discussion, because I think got that right, didn't I?
Thank you, Steve, also for the very nice answer. And I also have to thank both of you guys, Steve and John, because they just last year they managed to be guest editors, so a very successful special issue on advances in biological regulation. And thank you again for that. And
I don't think John should apologise for his own modelling being wrong, because my understanding of modelling is always wrong. It's just a question of how wrong.
Oh, right. Okay. So thank you again, Steve. And now switch in Italian. Lamberto, professor Lamberto Manzoli, il nostro igienista a Bologna, in tempi brevi, metto che sarà rapido, non molto lungo, le ultime parole famose, e aspettiamo quello che lui ci dirà, e credo che avrà un punto particolare sui vaccini, se non sbaglio.
Mi sentite? Sì. Buonasera a tutti. I'll switch to English, obviously, for Professor Ioannidis. Thank you very much, Professor COCCO, for calling me. And I have to say I'm a little bit emotional now, because I realize that right now that is the first time in my life that I speak in front of Professor Ioannidis. I mean, and in front of my sister. I've never done that before. I realize it's quite strange. Professor Ioannidis is a master. So it's not so, easy. Now we try. Okay. So today we talk a little bit about the research that we did from Bologna, from the University of Bologna. Not only, but we did a lot of research. First in Ferrara and then in Bologna, both universities, with the data of a region, the Abruzzo region, because I worked there for a long time. And so we had the availability of the data. Before we saw the data, in Italy, it's a huge problem. The regions are not giving the data, which are essential. So we had, we were very lucky, and we had the data from the Abruzzo region. So we could do a lot of studies on COVID. And let's try to see which. Okay. We did 27 published studies. Many on other problems, other issues on COVID, And then we have 6 on vaccines, 4 on the effectiveness, real-world effectiveness, with different follow-ups. We started after 6 months, and then we followed and made other studies later, and we just published the study after 24 months, 2 years from the start of the vaccination. Then we have 2 studies with data on the safety. I mean, they are limited, but we tried to do what we had with the data that we had. These studies had a lot of strengths, but also a lot of weaknesses, unfortunately. The strengths were the large sample. We made some studies with the entire Abruzzo region, with the data of all the population, 1,300,000, and all the data. I mean, we had the data of the national healthcare system. The analyses were adjusted for the time of the exposure, age, gender, and other comorbidities. And then the studies were really timely because we were able to publish them, I mean, like after 2 months from the timeline that we used. If we had an analysis on 6 months of follow-up, we were able to publish it after 8 months from the start of the vaccination, really timely, which was critical in the pandemics. And then the cost. There were practically no costs beside our work, obviously, which is, I mean, it has a cost. Limitations, which is, I have to say one thing about timeliness and costs. I mean, we have a lot of problems with the open, open science, open formats, the journals, the scientific journals like MDPI, some editors, which are a little bit predators. I mean, this is something small, but they also have one strength. They publish very quickly. And in the pandemics, this was important. Then limitations. Obviously, the true infection rate was unknown because obviously a lot of people, we all know that a lot of people were infected with the SARS-CoV-2 and they didn't know, just without symptoms. So anybody knows the true infection rate. Then we could evaluate only the adverse events of the vaccines that required an hospitalization. So unfortunately, we had no data on sudden deaths or asymptomatic diseases. Then the follow-up for the safety, for the adverse events, was quite short because we only had 18 months. It's inevitable because the vaccines were released less than 2 years ago, and obviously we could only have 18 months. But for the adverse events, this is short. Then the criteria followed to classify the deaths due to COVID-19. We all know that different countries had different criteria. And finally, the mortal time bias, which is something very technical. I will not discuss this because it would take 30 minutes. And then the green pass bias, which was a crazy bias due to the strategies that were used in Italy that we all know. Essentially, it was this, that the unvaccinated people were not allowed to go outside, I mean, they were not permitted to go outside, while vaccinated people could go and have a reasonable life. This obviously translated in more infections for the vaccinated people, more risk of infection for the vaccinated people than the unvaccinated. It's not so easy. I'm trying to obviously simplify. Then we made some studies. I will go short, brief, also because I cannot steal so much time to Professor Ioannidis, so I don't want to be the obstacle from. So this is, I go straight to the last studies that we did, those with the longest follow-up. So this is the safety. You see the title, COVID-19 vaccination did not increase the risk. This study was a problem for us because after this study, we have been killed by both the supporters, the extreme supporters of the vaccines and the no-vaxxers. I mean, I still receive like emails like threatening me because I published this study saying that they did not increase. And the people who knows me that I'm not an extremist, absolutely, about vaccinations. But you know, this was the data. So did not increase the risk of several potentially vaccine-related adverse events. I mean, we didn't have sudden deaths, and we didn't have data on hospitalizations, but we did have a lot of data. And these data, what do they show? They show that all the adverse events were lower among the vaccinated than the unvaccinated. The reference category here are the unvaccinated people. So myocardial infarction, ischemic stroke, hemorrhagic stroke, pulmonary embolism, deep vein thrombosis, they were all lower. Obviously, here we have a bias. So we did not conclude that the vaccination decreased the risk. We concluded that vaccination did not increase in 18 months. We don't know what will happen later, obviously, but in these 18 months, we were reassured, okay? Then, effectiveness. These are the data on COVID, the serious COVID disease. These are our studies. After 2 years of follow-up, after the start of the vaccination. What happened on the effectiveness? As we all know, some of these data are obvious. The percentage of the unvaccinated who had a serious COVID disease was almost 8%, while it was 1.6% among those with 3 or 4 doses, and the same 2 doses. These are raw estimates. Then I will show you the adjusted estimate. The problem was huge among the elderly. 26% of the unvaccinated had a serious COVID-19 disease, as opposed to 4% among the people who received the vaccine. These are huge. The same, more or less, for COVID-19 related deaths and all-cause deaths. You see, more or less, we have the same estimates. Different were the estimates on the infection. Unfortunately, as we all know now, but we didn't know before, now I know the people who's telling me, oh, this is obvious. The vaccines did not reduce the risk of infection at all. And indeed, they were much higher among the vaccinated, or at least similar. And now everybody knows that, but at the beginning, it was not so obvious. So unfortunately, we found no impact on the risk of infection. These are the adjusted estimates. I'm not going to all these numbers. Please believe me, I'm sorry for all these numbers. But believe me that the studies are full of numbers. We cannot do anything else like this. It's not our fault. What am I saying here? That more or less 80% less deaths or other outcomes, while the infections are even higher among the vaccinated. So again, the vaccines were able to protect from serious COVID diseases and COVID-related deaths, but were not able to protect from the infections. This is quite obvious. Then what we did also some meta-analysis on the risk of reinfection, because you know millions of Italians are now being infected. So we now have to study the risk of reinfection, not just infection, obviously. And we have to know this. So we did a meta-analysis on that. And this meta-analysis includes, more than 18 million subjects. And we found that the vaccines were able to reduce by almost 50% the risk of reinfection, but the risk of reinfection was not that high. And most importantly, fortunately, the risk of a secondary severe COVID disease was low, fortunately. So if we have been infected, the risk of having a second reinfection is not that high. I mean, it's less than 10%. But the risk of having a severe disease is very low. It's lower than 1 out of 1,000. So what we could say, what we can conclude from our studies. Obviously, the risk of severe COVID-19 or COVID-19 death was 60 to 80% lower among those who received 2 or 3 doses. And we all know more or less this. The impact was impressive among the elderly, while it was small among the youngers. I mean, that is obvious. I mean, it's an absolute risk reduction in our studies of 0.05% in 3 years, which is not that low, but is not definitely a huge impact. The protection did not substantially decrease within the first 18 months. Okay, now we have to say, you see the strange symbol here. I have to say, so these are quite important stuff. We talked before about the future lecture, the lessons that we could learn. I mean, one lesson is about the fact that the youngers were not such a high risk. So the policies cannot be the same. This is obvious, but we have to understand exactly how much the younger were at lower risk. Then, this is clear. Now we all know more or less the natural protection and even the protection after vaccination did not substantially decrease after 18 months. So at the beginning, we were told that the vaccines were lasting only 6 months. We all know that. That was simply untrue. This is that we have to learn that. Then the risk of infection was not reduced among the vaccinated subjects. I already said this. Why this is important? Because we are not going to say, we are going to say obviously that the vaccines were great, they were fantastic. We all agree on that. But this is very important to understand the lessons about the mandatory or not mandatory, because one pillar of the mandatory policies of the obligations were that the vaccines were blocking the infection, while they are not. So this is important from a public health point of view. Then the risk of reinfection, secondary severe disease was halved. I already said that. The overall risk of reinfection was lower than 10%. So the natural immunity also is protecting. I mean, 90% of effectiveness is not low after 3 years from the start of the pandemic. This is another important result. And the risk of severe disease following reinfection was lower, more or less 1 out of 1,000. Finally, I told you the safety. Then what am I presenting? I don't know how long am I going. Professor COCCO, how much is 2 minutes only? Okay, so we go very fast. Okay. So this is other studies, new studies. It is just an update that are more or less confirming more, not less. They are confirming our studies. I'm not going to show all of them. It is just to say that these are more or less confirmed. This is a study from a person, a young professor from a Greek-American professor, young, who is promising, and we all know, and it's great. And I thank, obviously, Professor A.IOANNIDIS, because it's a great, huge analysis, and which is very useful. And also other studies that are confirming more, I mean, with some difference, but they are confirming our results. You see the protection did not decrease substantially within 6 months. This is again the same thing. The funny part about this meta-analysis that was published on the Lancet was that they simply did not provide data on the studies, which is really strange for a meta-analysis on the Lancet. So we wrote that, we said, we thank you very much, please just provide the data, because it's very strange. Then other studies again, they are more or less confirming. And the final remark of 30 seconds, this is the study again from the Lancet. You have seen in the pandemics, probably, I don't know why, probably because of the timing, the problem, the issues. Many top level journals published the research of various levels, particularly strange. This is essentially what many of us would define a study on the spurious associations. Is essentially everything is associated with everything. There are some really funny parts. For example, what is associated with what? So how do they vote in the elections and political affiliations? Some things are clear, some others are crazy. For example, employment was associated with restaurant closures. So having a job was associated with the closures of the restaurant. It's like everything is associated with that. So we had a lot of problems. And obviously, another lesson is that in these times in which research is so fast and crazy, it's not easy to maintain a very high level of quality. Anyway, we did what we could. Obviously, research is not perfect, but really we tried to do what we could. And very important to say, the last time, the public university in Italy has a lot of problems, but it permitted studies with zero costs, totally independent, which is not something so normal. I mean, we have to recall and consider this also when we always criticize our system, our public system. We have a lot of problems, but we also have some strengths, the independence and the costs, which can be very low. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Grazie. Grazie, Lamberto. Domande in italiano. O se qualcuno vuole questions in English. John, you want to start with a question? So, no.
I'm afraid.
You don't want a question, friend?
No, John.
Lamberto, thank you for all this wonderful work. It's amazing how much you can do indeed with no cost and with very large sample sizes and valuable information. I think the take-home message that I get, but please do correct me, is that it's very difficult to make strong inferences in observational settings, especially when the compared groups are very different. I mean, you post that study in the Lancet that has amazing authors, but it's just nonsense. and I'm sure that they did their best, and I'm sure that if I had their data, I would have done probably even worse nonsense, just because people who we compare, for example, people vaccinated with 1, 2, 3, 4 doses, unvaccinated, are very different. You show that in your own data, which is something that most studies do not show, that there's a huge healthy vaccinee bias. Your hazard ratio for all-cause deaths is 0.19, which means that people who did not get vaccinated had 5 times higher risk of death. And I do believe that vaccines are effective, but I don't think that, they prevent heart attacks or, colon cancer or strokes or, glioblastoma or whatever it is. So I would expect their benefit for COVID deaths to translate to a little bit of moving the death risk overall, but not 5 times different. So these are not comparable entities. And what do you think going forward? I mean, currently we have effective vaccines, hopefully for some outcomes, but we have a new setting. We have endemicity. We have very low fatality rates, extremely low, I would say. And still, we need to make recommendations. Should we just go ahead and make recommendations, or do we need randomized trials for like yet another booster? Winter is coming. How do we decide on this? Many countries say just go ahead and get another booster, but where's the evidence for that? And do we need randomized trials instead of all the observational data, which will accrue no matter what?
Thank you, John. Absolutely agree. I mean, we did what we could. We couldn't do anything else. But absolutely, our data, like unfortunately all other real world data, observational data, were flawed. I mean, we had a lot of biases. And that's why in the studies on the safety, we simply concluded did not increase. Because, we were concerned about, absolutely, we need randomized trials. We definitely need them. It's crazy, let me say, that we approved the vaccines, the new vaccines, without any sort of trial, even small trial. I mean, I can understand something, but it's the first time that I remember something like that. They were simply approved. We definitely do need randomized research, absolutely, as we did before, before COVID, everything was working like that. And I understand something in the pandemics, the crazy, the emergency, and all the rest. But now, as you said, we can do. It's not such a big issue. And as regards the recommendations, obviously, this is political, unfortunately, because as a person, we may say, for example, before there was a slide in which there were the beds, the number of beds occupied by 100,000 people. And there was 150 was the highest with no intervention. And then it was 130 with like closures of schools and the universities and all the rest. And then 110 if there was also lockdowns and all the rest and saying that. And I have to say, this is political because in my opinion, I may think that reducing the occupied bed by 40 out of 100,000 and closing the schools, the universities, the shops, keeping people at home, destroying the economy and all the rest is not worth it. I mean, for me, it's like economically, I want to increase the gross domestic product of a country by 0.5%. So I will kill all the people that is aged over 70 years because it's more or less the same, but it's political. Obviously, one can decide to do like that. There was some people in Germany some years ago who did something like. So it's political. If we don't value some part of our culture, our system. So absolutely, we must choose to say, okay, the number of occupied beds need to be 130 rather than 150 out of 100,000 persons. We don't value the culture, the system, civility, and so on. If we value that, then we have to balance. And it's much more complex, obviously. And we have to find this balance. And I have an opinion, but it's political. Sorry. So,
please, John.
Grazie mille per l'onore di presentare questa riunione dell'Accademia delle Scienze. Allora, parlo in inglese. So I will try to present a reappraisal of what we have learned during the pandemic from the perspective of models, epidemiology, data and interventions. I think my perspective might be complementary to what you heard from Professor POWIS and from Professor MANZOLI. So we had a major crisis. We had a major mobilization of science, of the scientific workforce at large. This is some data that we published 2 years ago, and we have updated them. Roughly 2 million scientists from all over science published on COVID-19. They came from all fields of science to do this. And it's not that they work necessarily on their fields. For example, automobile engineers were the last group among the 174 fields of science to publish on COVID-19. They did not publish on how to create cars with better social distancing. They published on COVID-19 epidemiology. So it's a little bit like me becoming an automobile engineer. It's tremendous impact. 98 of the top 100 most cited papers during 2020 and 2021, these analyses that we published in PNAS last year, were on COVID-19. This is across all science. So COVID-19 was 98% of science, top impact, and all other science was 2 out of 100. It seems a bit weird, isn't it? Most of this research was at the level of junk. I cannot give a better characterization than that. There's multiple empirical evaluations looking at the methodology, at the errors, at the biases of that research. It's just horrible. But there were also many aspects that were very well done. And there were also successes. We had vaccines, for example, developed in record time, and they seem to be effective, at least for hard outcomes. Most science, especially in the beginning, I would say almost all science and all decision-making depended on models. So models have a history of centuries, and epidemiological models have a history of about 1 century. Models are very easy to fail. We knew that. We knew that before. We knew that models were a little bit like sketches. Instead of having Tibaldi here, I would have John Ioannidis come up with a sketch and just say, this is my fresco. And now you do everything for policy based on this sketch that I just jotted down. Pretty scary. Why scary? Because our data were very poor. We didn't even know how many people were dying in the beginning. We had numbers, we had undercounting, we had overcounting, number of cases, forget it. We were 10 times, 20 times, 50 times, 100 times off in the beginning. We had to work with that. Sometimes we didn't even use that. Maybe that was better. But it was just very, very difficult. So models became very dominant. I mean, you saw that my great colleague, Professor POWIS, was still showing you the models of Imperial College that are 32 times off in terms of what eventually really happened. 30 times off to me is a disaster, especially when it means that following that model, you shut down society, you shut down the economy, you shut down schools, you shut down businesses, you shut down mental health, you shut down health, you shut down everything. To me, it's a crime against humanity. But, these are models that are still in the mainstream in some venues. Why are models failing? Well, here's a very long list in a paper that we published in the International Journal of Forecasting. Poor data input that go into theory-based forecasting. SIR models have a history of about 1 year. They haven't really changed since then. I mean, would you use something that is 1 century old? I mean, this is what we did to shut down society. Poor data input for database forecasting, for example, time series. Anyone who has worked on time series knows that you're trying to predict the future. And goodness, the future cannot be predicted meaningfully, especially when you have something that is going to last for 3 years. Maybe I can predict a little bit about what will happen next week, but 3 years. Wrong assumptions in the modeling. I can talk forever about that. High sensitivity of the estimates. If you move one estimate a little bit in the assumptions, then your projection may be completely off. Lack of incorporation of epidemiological features. Very little epidemiology went into these modeling. I have to say that most of these models were not done by epidemiologists. They were done by physicists. Sorry, Lucio. They were done by, shipping experts. They were done by influencers.
they were done by social media personas sometimes. Poor past evidence on effects of available interventions. Yes, we knew what had happened in 1918. We had some observational evidence from 1918. You know, Lamberto said that observational evidence from 2022 or 23 is not reliable. You know, think about observational evidence from 1918 on how reliable that can be. Lack of transparency, and I'll come back to that. Just plain errors. I make errors all the time. I'm a scientist. This is what I do. I make errors. Hopefully I find some of them at some point. Lack of determinacy, looking at only one or a few dimensions of a problem at hand. The pandemic was a multidimensional problem. It was not just about COVID cases. It was about everything in our life. And we just looked at COVID cases and maybe hospitalizations, which hospitalizations, some countries hospitalized in the beginning every single patient who was diagnosed with COVID-19. And some countries continue to do that for the first year. In Serbia, where I collaborate with their national team in Vojvodina, all children, not adults, all children in the first year, they were hospitalized. None of them had serious illness. All of them were hospitalized. Lack of expertise in crucial disciplines, groupthink, bandwagon effects. Once Johnny Ioannidis says so, has to be like that. Everybody just follows Johnny Ioannidis or whoever that idiot might be. And selective reporting. Once you have one narrative, everything is selectively reported to fit the narrative. Everything fits to what I have preordained to be the truth. Transparency, at least models should be transparent. But we know, and this is an empirical evaluation that I did with Emanuel Zavolic from Karolinska, that infectious disease models are not transparent. What do I mean by transparent? This is an analysis of 1,338 papers that we looked at, and we tried to see how many of them share the code, the algorithm. If you don't have the algorithm, you cannot really rebuild the model. How many of them share the data? How many of them are registered? So about 20%, 25% shared data, 25% shared code. Both of them, about 7%. And registration, almost none, with just a couple of exceptions. Registration means that I put somewhere in a public repository that I'm doing this modeling, by the way, and I'm predicting that for the next 2 weeks, there's going to be 572 hospitalizations, confidence from 374 to 794, and then someone can check that. So what happened, John? Well, there were only 20 hospitalizations. Oh, okay. We need to dial back. Or there were 5 million hospitalizations. Oh, goodness, you need to fix that for the next iteration. So pre-registration of models is something that can be done. And I wrote that paper in Mathematical Biosciences to say how that could be done. Is it just utopia? No. After all that disaster, now we have teams in the US and in Germany and in Poland, I'm not sure about Italy, maybe there are, that do pre-register their predictions. So now we can compare notes. What did you predict and what really happened? And it's time sealed, it's in a public view, everyone can judge and say. Now, there's other aspects of the modeling that probably cannot be pre-registered. So a model needs to be flexible. You need to be able to change it, but that's okay. You know what is fixed and you know what is flexible. And I would say that I'm not asking for pre-registration of every little detail. I'm asking just for pre-registration of what matters. And this can be done. When we do compare models that were very influential, we tried to get some better sense on why they were so disastrously wrong. So I think the most disastrously wrong model was the ones generated by Imperial College, maybe because they had the best scientists in modeling. So they took their work very seriously and they made predictions and they published them very quickly. And then they published some of their work in Nature. But we just went to see, for example, what they published in Nature. Good for them. They did share their code and the data that they had used. But we also knew that besides what they had published in Nature for what happened in 2020 in Europe, they had developed another model that they applied to the states of the United States. So they had 2 models. They applied one to European countries and another one to United States countries. Why? No reason. So we said, okay, let's take the model that they have developed and that they have applied to the United States and tried to apply to the European countries. The conclusions were entirely different. So the nature model suggested that lockdown was tremendously effective, and within a month it saves 3 million people. The other model that they had developed showed that lockdown had absolutely no benefit, practically. Now, which model is the best? You can compare different metrics that are information gain versus parsimonious structure of the model. And the conclusion is that the model that they did not report in Nature was far better than the model that they reported in Nature. It fit much better to the data, but it showed absolutely no benefit from lockdown. Well, Nature published the wrong model that showed tremendous benefit from lockdown. So forget about models, or let's keep them a little bit at a hand's or arms or more than an arm's distance. We need them. I do a lot of them. I think most of them are wrong. Yeah, I will continue sketching. I'm not going to be Tibaldi just by sketching. How about hard outcomes? What happened at the end of the day? Excess deaths. Okay, so how do we calculate excess deaths? We compare a previous period before the pandemic to what happened during the pandemic. And we can make different adjustments. We can say there's also some slope, there's some evolution over time. We need to adjust for population structure, hopefully. That's basic, Epidemiology 101. Most excess death calculations have not adjusted for population structure. What does this mean? It means that European populations, for example, are becoming older all the time. But these models, published in prestigious journals like Lancet and like Nature, they don't adjust for the structure and the change in structure of the population. They would have failed Epidemiology 101 for first-year students. If you adjust for that, this is what you get. With age adjustment estimates, if you take Germany, for the first 2 years of the pandemic, we estimate 43,000 excess deaths. In our hands, without age adjustment, we calculate 117,000 excess deaths. Lancet, no age adjustment, 203,000 excess deaths. eLife, 88,000 excess deaths. Economist, 113 excess deaths. Another colleague who adjusted for age, only 22,000. Another one who did not, 130,000. Recorded number, 111. Germany is a classic example because the age structure of the population is changing very rapidly and is becoming an older population over time. And this applies pretty much to most of our European countries. This is from another paper that we published in the European Journal of Epidemiology, looking at all possible assumptions. So this is a multiverse analysis. We say, okay, we may have different assumptions. Let's try all possible combinations of these assumptions, see what happens. And we do see these trajectories and then uncertainty in the estimates over time. And we can make some conclusions. The United States did horribly. There's no doubt about it. All models suggest that the United States did horribly in terms of excess deaths. The United States was doing horribly even before the pandemic. All the other countries that are wealthy, high income, they were decreasing their mortality rates. The United States was not getting any better. And I can tell you why. I mean, we have serious problems in our social structure, in our welfare. We have people who are marginalized, people who are poor, people who are, you see them in the street every day. People have no access to healthcare, people who are overdosing. We had a pandemic of overdose in the US during the pandemic of COVID-19. You see that other countries were doing well and continue to do well. Sweden was doing very well and continued to do very well, no matter what the assumptions are. So with different assumptions, the United States is always going to be the worst or among the worst. And countries like Scandinavian countries and South Korea and Australia are always going to be among the best for 2020 and 2021. How about moving out to 2023? These are data going to August, actually July 23rd, 2023. These are calculations, and that paper hopefully should come out soon. This is from the preprint, but has been provisionally accepted. This is looking at time slices from March 2020 all the way to July 2023. And I have separated for you two types of countries. You have countries that are vulnerable because of their socioeconomic indicators. It means that they're below the cut for GDP per person, or in terms of inequality of income, or in terms of proportion of people who are below poverty. They fail in one or more of these three indicators. and others that do very well on all of these indicators. So the US is pretty rich, but it has a lot of inequality. So it's a vulnerable country. Italy, I have also counted in the vulnerable countries, if you look at the three indicators. So what you see is that in the beginning, it was pretty chaotic. Actually, countries that had very problematic health systems, many of them, they did very well, just because nobody was visiting them. You know, nobody was visiting Bulgaria in wintertime. So the wave did not arrive early on, but once it hit, it was a disaster. And countries that were vulnerable, some of them started not very well. For example, Belgium or Sweden did not start very well in the first 6 months, but eventually they did amazingly well at the end of the day. And if you compare versus 2017 to 2019, the three pre-pandemic years, and adjust for the age structure, countries like Sweden, they had fewer deaths during the pandemic compared to the pre-pandemic. They had 3.5% fewer deaths in Sweden during the pandemic compared to before the pandemic. One might say, we want to see more such years in the future. That sounds like anathema, but I mean, that's what the data show. And you can see the same data in these plots against capita GDP, per capita GDP, also taking into account the age distribution for age 64 to and over 65. What matters during the pandemic is to be able to diminish the imprint, the impact of the virus. So we need to identify who's at maximal risk and do our best to protect these people. So infection fatality rate, the risk gradient and stratification of risk is important for personal risk understanding and for personal protection. The question is, did we manage to protect more those who were at higher risk compared to those who were at lower risk? That would be in the good direction. You know, it's unavoidable that people will get infected one way or another, but at least do we manage to protect those who are at lower risk? We compared data from 38 pre-vaccination national seroprevalence studies that have very good quality of information. And what we saw is that most countries did not achieve this. But there were exceptions. There were some countries that actually did manage to protect, for example, the elderly compared to the non-elderly, and they had lower infection rates in the elderly compared to the non-elderly. Children, pretty much same infection rates with a little bit of deviation here and there compared to the non-pediatric population. In the elderly, the infection fatality rate in community dwelling elderly was 4 times lower compared to what went in the original modeling calculations. It was about 2% in those more than 70. It was devastating in nursing home residents, about 30%. So nursing home residents were devastated, and the virus was part of this, but another part of this was that nursing residents were abandoned. Many of them died because of hunger, of lack of water, of lack of care, nobody wishing to approach them, people with Alzheimer's disease, with chronic disabilities, suddenly being isolated in a space station that nobody wants to see, touch, approach, do anything with them. This is what happened in Sweden. These are data from the national Swedish databases. Data from nursing home residents in Sweden suggests that those who were infected with SARS-CoV-2 had about a 30-fold increase in the risk of death in the first month after infection. But then the risk decreased to below baseline. And that means that these people eventually caught up in terms of mortality compared to those who were not infected. The loss of life years for these people was less than a year. It was not life years, it was life months. These were people mostly who had life expectancy of just a few months. And yes, they did die in a month, and they would have died on average within about 10 months or 12 months. This is what Lamberto showed, our study looking at the national seroprevalence studies that had reliable, or at least the most reliable data. 38 of them from different countries, and this is the rates. As I said, they're 4 times lower compared to the estimates that went into the dominant modeling, and especially in young populations, they're even lower than 4 times. They may be 10 times lower compared to the assumptions that were made. Reinfections, Lamberto touched on that. Reinfections now have been pretty common. When we started, we saw very few of them. This is some data from Vojvodina, where we have the national data and the national team working with us. We can see the risk of detected reinfection over time after the primary infection. Detected is a subset of all reinfections, and we don't know exactly what subset, but it could be that the true reinfections are 4 times bigger. So within 21 years, maybe almost everyone is even reinfected. And if you look at the risk of reinfection, again, of documented reinfection versus primary infection, hospitalization risk is 4 times lower, death risk is 10 times lower. And if you look at children, we saw no death in a whole country from reinfection over a year, not a single death. Now, we saw a lot of hospitalizations, especially in the first year. Why? Because, as I said, all children were hospitalized even if they had no symptoms, because news, Financial Times and Washington Post and CNN, Fox, I don't care, were saying that everybody's dying. So children had to be hospitalized massively, even though they had no symptoms. This is data from Denmark about the infection fatality rates. No, they're not comparable to the flu. They're astronomically lower than the flu. Don't compare COVID-19 currently with the flu. Decision-making, both personal and public, must be multidimensional. It needs to consider all dimensions, everything that could go wrong, and everything that can be affected by what we do. This is an early paper that I published at the beginning of the pandemic, and I noted there that there's causes that should cause us concern. Excess deaths due to people with acute myocardial infarction, another acute disease not given proper hospital care, people with cancer having delayed treatment, disrupted cancer prevention, other healthcare disruptions, suicides, violence, domestic homicide, starvation, tuberculosis, childhood diseases, alcoholism, and other diseases of despair, multiple chronic diseases, lack of proper medical care. I was told I'm a complete idiot to raise these issues. You can tell me whether any of those have not happened in massive scale. Another thing that many of us who are epidemiologists were saying at the very beginning was that we need randomized trials, especially for monumental measures like lockdown measures. I feel like a complete idiot that throughout the pandemic, I advocated strongly for masks. The 4 randomized trials that have been done show that they have absolutely no effectiveness. I'm an idiot, and I apologize for this. How many were done eventually? We did 10,000 randomized trials for drugs, mostly profit drugs, but also some like ivermectin that are also not effective. And we just did 30 trials, mostly small ones, of non-pharmaceutical interventions. Most of them are non-informative. So we have all of these aspects to consider. We have government response with non-pharmaceutical interventions like lockdowns. We have psychological tactics with crowd manipulation and crowd control. We knew that the best psychologists jumped to the fray and tried to create material that would terrorize practically the population about the risks. We have social isolation, meaninglessness, anxiety, frustration, aggressive feelings, rising inequalities. People who were marginalized became even more marginalized by the measures that we took. We have aggression, social rejection, breakdown of normal behavior, social unrest, and all of that in the setting of societies that already face social order instability, healthcare, welfare support was minimal. Other crises, war. We've seen war. We are seeing more war this week. Pre-existing poverty and hardship, pre-existing mental health problems. On top of that, financial insecurity and hardship, learning losses, mental and physical health deterioration, and collective trauma. Yes, and we had COVID-19 cases as well. China fooled us all. It administered lockdown and 0 COVID. Do we really know what happened in China when they opened up? Not really. This is something that I published a few months ago in JAMA Internal Medicine, trying to put together what we know and what might have happened in China. We also published some calculations trying to estimate what are likely the number of deaths that happen after China opened up. What we do know is that their COVID-19 zero COVID approach completely failed, and everybody started getting infected within days of opening up. We estimate about 1 million deaths or 600,000 deaths from COVID-19 if we use the population of Hong Kong or South Korea that also tried for zero COVID, and at some point they had to open up. But these numbers, which are lower compared to other estimates, are nothing compared to the numbers of deaths, excess deaths from disruption. For example, data from Hong Kong suggest that there was an acute increase of acute myocardial infarction deaths during lockdown because people did not go to the hospital, they did not want to go to the hospital. If you transpose these data from Hong Kong to the entire China, you have almost 1.5 million deaths just from not good cardiac care, which is more than the number of COVID-19 deaths. This is just one cause. Getting to the truth about excess deaths is very difficult. I have seen all of these problems, and we put that paper together, tried to summarize problems about making an estimate of what happened. No adjustment for changing population structure, no adjustment for changes in other high-risk indicators. For example, what's happening in nursing homes? Are nursing home populations increasing or decreasing? Completeness corrections. Many of the data on mortality, if you exclude a few countries like Italy, are very incomplete. So it depends on how you correct these data, and correctness may change during the pandemic because resources for ascertainment of deaths changes. Sensitivity to modeling choice, post hoc corrections in specific countries, all-cause mortality modeling, underestimation of uncertainty, excess death estimates per risk strata, and causal misinterpretation. It's very difficult even to find out what happened with how many people died. If we cannot decide on this, let alone what can we say about other aspects. If you compare, for example, the United States, Germany, and India, the estimates of excess deaths by the WHO suggest that India had massive excess deaths of close to 5 million deaths. Well, if you run the population structure of India and you extrapolate what we saw in other countries where we do have reliable data, if India had 5 million excess deaths, 4.5 of these millions were not due to COVID-19. They were due to the measures that we took. 90% were due to the measures. So this is the comparison of recorded COVID deaths, excess deaths by, let's say, the economists, and adjusted estimates with age adjustment. You can see how different these estimates are. Same thing, and this is Epidemiology 101. And then another comparison of recorded COVID-19 deaths, excess deaths according to the economist, and then expected COVID-19 deaths in different countries, including countries that are not high-income countries, where we just have a big mystery about what happened. Africa, we lack data in Africa, but what we do have data on is that African populations had a very high frequency of pre-existing cross-reactive humoral immunity, and an even higher proportion, more limited data, but up to 80% had cross-reactive T-cell immunity. And it maps very well with malaria, but I don't know what else it might map to, which means a very young population, perhaps with some pre-existing immunity, may have had practically no impact of COVID-19, no major impact on mortality. But obviously, whatever we did to a vulnerable population would be completely disruptive. Going forward, and I will close with that, I think we made a lot of mistakes. I think that personally, as an epidemiologist, I feel horrible. And I include myself in this because, you know, if I'm the most highly cited X or Y epidemiologist, you know, I should be the one to feel more horrible about this disaster. But we need to focus more on solving these problems that are at the underbelly of the pandemic: social injustice, inequalities, racism, poverty, smoking, a very strong risk factor. Smoking is killing 7 to 10 million people every year, and it killed even more with COVID-19. Other modifiable risk factors in lifestyle, obesity, again, a very strong risk factor. Poor protection of nursing homes. Nursing homes were devastated first before the rest of the population was infected. Poor adoption of effective public health measures, simple measures, not lockdown. Adoption of harmful pro-contagion public health measures like blind or draconian lockdowns. Suboptimal and harmful treatments and medical care, lack of effective vaccination, inefficient vaccination strategies. So I think if we could solve some of these problems, we could do much better. And I'm not talking about the past, I'm talking about the future. What we need is what, along with Arnaud Scioliero and Stefano Tancredi, we call slow data public health. We need not any sort of data and not any sort of panic, but data that are fit for purpose, that we do make some decisions, yes, immediately, but then we revise them based on very carefully collected information that avoids the infodemic, that just doesn't depend on big data, because big data do not speak by themselves. They're full of biases, and do not confuse surveillance research. Currently, we're confused between media, social media, infodemic, surveillance, research, and action. These are very different things. Pandemic preparedness is important. We need to be well prepared, but pandemic preparedness should not disrupt life. It should not disrupt education. It should not disrupt society. It should not disrupt everyday living. It should not disrupt mental health. It should not disrupt healthcare. It should not disrupt everything. Pandemic preparedness requires evidence, reproducible evidence. Conversely, we should improve living conditions and opportunities, especially for those who are in need and who are disadvantaged. We need to build and maintain trust in public health, which unfortunately has been shattered. And we need to see the big picture and not lose track of that big picture. With many thanks to a number of colleagues with whom I have co-authored about 90 papers on COVID-19. Probably most of them are wrong. And I look forward pointing out mistakes by the audience. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you that much, John. Was okay, thank you. Yes, as usual, fantastic lecture. You know, we're just outlining the main points. And questions? No one. Lamberto. I knew that.
Oh, thank you very much. Thank you very much, Johnny. My question is a little bit out of the field, because as an epidemiologist, you showed just a tiny part, because I know that you know much more than this, and it is much more than this. It is just a question about your feeling, how, if and how we can try to reduce the gap that is increasing in the last years between the evidence, scientific evidence, and the policies that are made. You know, the policies are made by the media. And so we have the media who can take some evidence, or just not even take any evidence, and push a political agenda. So if you may, I know it's out of the comfort, it's not an epidemiological question, and I'm very sorry for that, please. But you know, you are such a person. So if you may have a sense of what we may do beside the epidemiological part that you do perfectly and fantastically, but if there is a way to try to reduce this gap that is increasing, not only in medicine.
Excellent question, Lamberto. And I don't have a silver bullet. I don't have a magic solution for that. Media, social media, government, politics, politicians, influencers, they're devastatingly more powerful than science and scientists. So as a scientist, I felt completely thwarted during the pandemic. You know, I started publishing some work and immediately got attacked by right wing in one country, left wing in another country, extreme right, extreme left, depending on what the political influencer media, social media milieu would be. And it was very weird, because it was the same kind of findings, the same results, numbers. I mean, how can you attack numbers? Numbers could be wrong, but you cannot attack them because of ideology. So I don't have a good solution other than saying that science should be protected, should be a protected species, not to be thwarted by ideologies, by outside forces, by conflicts, by all sorts of external forces, and just be left alone to come up with some numbers, come up with some estimates, try to communicate them peacefully, and then decisions can be made. With the same numbers, people can make different decisions. In the absence of good evidence, very different decisions may be justified, but it's unfortunate that we don't get good evidence for many of these questions, because they're very quickly swamped by media and influencers and politicians, and then you cannot do anything. You're frozen. Within media, I include even our scientific journals, because many of the scientific journals, especially the high-impact scientific journals, and I've been on the editorial board of several of them, they have become media influencers. On many of the pandemic questions, you had Nature and Science and Lancet publishing news stories and features and editorials within zero time with no data, and then everything was frozen. If you were to be a good scientist, you had to follow that narrative, because not a scientist, a journalist, a news journalist in Science or Nature wrote this overnight, or less than overnight. He got the instruction at 3 o'clock in the afternoon, and he published that in Nature by 7 p.m., literally. When I saw that, I went back and saw journalists published in Nature and Science. Okay, how many papers do they publish? So I published that work in Scientometrics. There's people who have published in Nature and Science more than 700 papers. Some of them have published more than 2,000 papers. Who are they? Completely clueless non-scientists who publish on science. Are they well-intentioned? I'm sure that they're well-intentioned. Are they conflicted? No, I don't think so. Can I see their conflicts of interest? No, they're almost never declared, because it is assumed that they're well-intentioned. But they set the science. It takes me months and years to do science. If I'm fast, maybe I can do a little bit very quickly. I cannot do it in 3 hours. But they have set the record on what were the excess deaths. Lockdown was effective. The infection fatality rate. I mean, you saw earlier on, Financial Times, the infection fatality rate is declared by Financial Times, not by the scientific literature.
Unfortunately, this is what happened. And I want just to add a comment. We are not learning nothing. You know, the lessons that pandemic gave us, we did not learn anything. Mainly here in Italy, where we are putting less and less money on public health. And this is a real disaster. Anyway, we should... Many other questions? No? Okay. Allora, thank you again, John. E andiamo avanti per la parte finale con il professor Viale, che non ha bisogno di presentazioni e sappiamo bene tutto quello che ha fatto durante la pandemia, ma soprattutto un grande infettivologo. Per cui parliamo di Covid.
Sono ingrassato.
Però vedi, ingrassare non va bene perché l'obesity, ma non siamo obesi. Grazie.
Thank you very much for the kind invitation. I have had the opportunity to listen to a couple of presentations of Professor A.IOANNIDIS in the 2 years or 3 years ago, and listening his presentation today, I had the same sensation, to stay in a storm of new ideas, innovative vision. It's always an incredible experience to listen to you. So thank you very much. I am Professor COCCO did a terrible joke to me, giving me the task to speak after Professor A.IOANNIDIS. It's impossible to reach the same level of quality. And forgive me, I am a simple clinician, so I represent the voice of the people working every day with patients with COVID. I think that the venue deserves an Italian-speaking presentation. Which do you prefer? A presentation in English language or a presentation in Italian language? They say. I decided to depict my presentation using 5 questions. And but I would like to start my presentation with an historical data. This is the the announcement of the end of a plague outbreak, written by King Louis XV in the middle of the 17th century. Political action decided that the outbreak was ended. And 4 centuries after, in April 2023, the President of the United States declared that the COVID pandemic was ended. So what does it mean, the end of a pandemic? This is the first question. Do pandemic ever end, or we are at the beginning of a new wave of COVID? Because the last data in Italy are a little bit worrisome about this hypothesis. But I would like to restart from the previous point. What does it mean, the end of a pandemic? Is not a clinical decision, but is a decision based on several issues, political, economical, and not only clinical. Simply, the declaration of the end of pandemic means that the time of emergency probably is closed. At the time of lockdowns is closed, and that the time of cohabitation with the virus and the time of responsibilization of people about the right cohabitation and the right actions against the virus is coming. This is the last report from the Italian government about the evolution of the pandemic in Italy, and we have seen an increase of cases during the second part of August and during the month of September, and a significant level of fear was surged, especially on the mass media. But in reality, the true indicator of the evolution of the pandemic, represented by the impact of the pandemic on the healthcare system, first of all, on the hospital activity, demonstrates that we are not living a new wave of infection. And also looking at the data related to the last 2 weeks, we can see favorable evolution both of hospitalization rates, ICU admissions, and death related to COVID. Looking at the stratification of hospitalization rate, ICU admission, and deaths, it's clear that the problem involves mainly the population, the aged population with more than 75, 80 years. But this is by definition, a very trial population in which several accidents can generate the death of the patients. An 85-year-old patient can die after a break in a bone, can die after an abdominal perforation, can die after a flu episode, can die thanks to a COVID episode. But at the moment, the COVID doesn't have a main role in generating the death of aged people. Is one of the disease that can be associated to the death of a very frail population like aged population. This is the same for hospitalization rate, ICU admissions rate, and mortality rate. All the problems are related to the aged population. About the vaccination, the role of vaccine, Professor Manzoli and Professor A.IOANNIDIS have explained absolutely better than me the role of vaccination. These are the statement of Center for Disease Control updated to the end of September, where the position of CDC is absolutely in favor of vaccination, and the statement says that everyone should get at least one update of the vaccine. This is true for general population. It is particularly relevant for immunosuppressed patients and for unvaccinated people. The position of CDC is not in favor to a specific vaccine. We have three vaccines based on two different vaccine platforms, RNA vaccine or protein vaccine. There is no difference in efficacy. The main message is vaccinate, have an update of your previous vaccination. We are confident that the updated vaccine targeting the XBB.1.5 variant, that is the most impacting variant in Italy, will be protected also against other sub-variant of Omicron variant, because they share a pattern of spike amino acid quite similar. And this is the situation of variants in Italy. And as you can see, the XBB variant and the IG variant are significantly predominant. Today, the third increasing variant that is named PIERLUIGI at now have a sporadic distribution in Italy. But there are several concerns about the immunologic activity of the upgraded vaccine against the PIERLUIGI variants, but the scientific world is not worried about this risk, because we are talking about sub-variants of the same variant, that is Omicron. So these are all sub-variants of the same main variant. So we are confident that the upgraded vaccine will generate a level of protection sufficient. But talking about the vaccine, the question the most important question is what we do want from a vaccine today. When we started vaccine campaign, our goal was to reduce infections. Now, in a population with reached a very high level of immunity based on vaccine and or a previous infection, our goal is not to reduce infection. Our goal is to reduce the impact of COVID on the activity of healthcare systems, is to reduce hospitalization, severe diseases, and death. to save hospital beds, to save ICU beds. And sorry. I would like to, Professor Giannidis, forgive me for the statistical analysis of this work. This is a paper recently published. It is a systematic review and a meta-regression analysis of the protective effect of vaccination and or infection. So protective level of a previous infection, a vaccination, and the so-called hybrid immunity, vaccination plus infection. There's a very large number of trials, but at the end, 26 studies evaluated. And the effectiveness on previous infection is good, but wane during the subsequent 12 months, while the protective effect of hybrid immunity wanes during the successive 12 months, but in a very lower rate. But what's important is not, this is not our goal talking about vaccination, because you see that the protection against any type of infection wanes during the time, both for previous infection and hybrid immunity and hybrid immunity plus vaccine. But what our goal is represented by this picture, the very low effect of hybrid immunity in respect to hospital admission or severe disease. This is exactly what we want. Now that we are living in an era in which, thanks to the viral evolution, thanks to our immunological confidence, we can we don't be feared of the infection, but we must control the impact of the infection. We must be worried only about the severe disease and the impact of the disease against in the activity of our healthcare system. So this is an example of the need to cohabit with the virus, accept the circulation of the virus, but continues to work and to work against the risk that the virus can generate the dramatic situation we have lived in 2020 and 2021. So, basic on this view, the vaccine works and works very well, and so the invitation to vaccine everyone remain a pivotal action against the not against in the cohabitation with the COVID virus. We have a second option to contain the clinical effect of virus represented by antiviral treatment. Trial for the evaluation of a new drug often have several bias in terms of methodology. And the registrative trial of nirmatrelvir that today represent the best option we have in the area of antivirals was a study enrolling 2,000 patients, but they were not vaccinated patients, and the study was conducted during the Delta era, not during the Omicron era. So the study was useful to realize that, to understand the potential value of antiviral, but today we must look at different studies like this. This is a very large studies conducted in the United States evaluating 95,000 of patients treated with nirmatrelvir or molnupiravir. This is a typical real-life studies with the bias of the real-life studies, but with a number of patients evaluated absolutely significant. These are patients vaccinated, enrolled during the Omicron era. This is patients with different risk factors, with patients not selected with the same methodology of a trial for the treatment with an antiviral. So a look in what happens every day. And you see that the age of population enrolled changed with the age, and this is expected, but the data is that independently, the main data is that independently, but the type of antiviral, molnupiravir or nirmatrelvir, the treatment, the early treatment impact on the outcome of the patients, both if we consider the incidence of death or we consider the incidence of ICU admission. A similar study was conducted in Italy, enrolling more or less 30,000 of patients, and the results are quite similar. So antiviral are not the solution for in the war against COVID, but in a status of post-pandemic, in a status of endemization of the disease, they could be useful to contain in people at risk the risk to evolve toward a severe condition. But in this favorable area, is there any residual complexity related to COVID? And is there one or more population for whom the COVID could represent a severe disease also in the post-pandemic era? Unfortunately, the answer is yes, because inside the large number of frail population, frail people, we have extremely frail people with a significant lower vaccine response level, so maintaining a high risk infection and not able to clear the virus, so with a higher risk, with a higher viral load, and with a higher risk of severe or persisting infection. When we talk about immunosuppressed people, we talk about with a population with an incredible variability of underlying disease. The term immunosuppressant doesn't have a true significance if we don't depict the type of immunosuppression the patient has. And so the classical risk factors defined during the first and the second waves of COVID probably are insufficient to identify the true patient with a true risk to have a severe or persistent disease. So we must work to reevaluate the risk factors and to define better the population with a maximal risk of disease, the population that should be treated and managed in a different way and with a lower level of optimism in the management of the disease. This is one of the several studies demonstrating that in immunocompromised patients, the action of the vaccine decline quickly during the time. And this is, for example, what happens in a population in hematological stem cell transplant people, one of the most immunosuppressed between the immunosuppressed. And as you can see, the rate of in a study conducted before the vaccination, the rate of hospital admission, the rate of need of ICU were absolutely unacceptable. Sorry. But antiviral treatment in these patients works, because in these patients, the use of inactive monoclonal antibodies and the use of antivirals impacted favorably on the outcome of the disease. So the key message about this patient is that if you have a treatment choice, transplant this patient, accept the risk, because we can treat the disease. The immunosuppression term is extremely variable. This is a population of organ transplant patients with in which our goal was to define the risk of the disease and the risk of severe disease very quickly. Patient with solid organ transplantation doesn't have a risk of severe disease incredibly higher than normal population, absolutely lower than hematological patients, for example. So in transplant patients, the vision of the management could be more optimistic than in other type of immunosuppressive patients. This is a very nice review about the significance of the term immunocompromission in several types of patients, and permitted us to identify the highest risk population represented by people with B-cell malignancies or people treated with anti-B-cell monoclonal antibodies, or people treated with chimeric antigenic T lymphocyte. This is the population in which the virus has a lot of time to generate a damage to the patient. And this is a population also unable to respond to the vaccine and unable to clear the virus. And this is the population probably today maintaining the highest risk to have a severe COVID infection or not to clear the COVID. So the COVID in these patients represent a risk for an acute date or a risk for an indirect date related to the fact that it hampers the strategy to treat the disease. If the patient needed a transplantation, normally the hematologist wait for the clearance of the virus before transplant the patient, before start the transplant procedure. So in this patient, we must pay the highest level of attention to this type of patient because they represent the archetype of the residual complexity of COVID. The last question is this: what did pandemic leave us? Pandemic left us a lot of good observations. We learned the value of telemedicine. We learned the value of equity. We demonstrate our resilience. We understand that our aged and bad-built hospital could be dangerous for the patients. We realized that healthcare system is not sufficiently sustained by the government. We understood that investing in healthcare is important for the quality of our society. We learned a lot of things, probably useful for the progress of the healthcare system in the future. But pandemic left us also several important problems. The mystery of post-COVID disease, long COVID disease, is an example. We don't know what this condition is. It is not clear if it is a psychological disease or if it is a true physical disease. But I would like to focus your attention for 5 minutes to one of the worst heritage of COVID. You know that before the COVID, we were living a silent pandemic represented by the evolution of antimicrobial resistance. And the provision of Center for Disease Control made in 2019 for the 2022, the 2023, talked about 5 million of deaths associated with the bacterial, with antimicrobial resistance, including 1,300,000 of deaths attributable to antimicrobial resistance. This predictive model probably is wrong because the impact, the post-COVID impact of AMR is absolutely higher than what proposed in this and in other models. Because during the pandemic, we made 3 actions favoring the evolution and the increase of antimicrobial resistance. The overcrowding of patients in hospital, admitted in hospital and in ICU for a lot of time, an incredible level of medicalization of these patients, and incredible use of antibiotics in these patients, both in the hospital and the community, and the loss of the prevention culture by healthcare workers. Because during the pandemic, our goal was to protect ourselves from the patients and not protect the patient from ourselves. Exactly, exactly what normally is considered a behavior mistake. And so these 3 factors generated a higher circulation of MDR microorganisms, and now the persistence of the AMR pandemic. Inside the Italian and European hospital today, the circulation of AMRL bacteria, of multi-drug resistant bacteria, has increased incredibly and continues to increase. So there is a worrisome question about this problem. And this is the question: could antimicrobial resistant pandemic hamper the progress of medicine? Yesterday, I had a meeting with my colleagues of Niguarda Hospital in Milan, because they asked me several advice about the management of a 25-year-old girl with congenital hepatic disease, having received an liver transplantation in the middle of August. This young girl, coming from Morocco, was colonized inside her gut by MDM Klebsiella pneumoniae, one of the worst phenotype of resistance we can see today. And from August to yesterday, she has had 6 episodes of septic shock related to the same strain. And medical doctor, surgeon, infectivologist, microbiologist was not able to sterilize the patient, was not able to defeat the NDM. And after the NDM Klebsiella, after our meeting, the key question posed was, okay, but if tomorrow a new patient with NDM, Klebsiella pneumoniae colonization arrives, may we transplant him? And this is a very worrisome question because microbe can hamper the decision to transplant a patient. This is a dramatic condition, but if we go to count how many money was spent by Niguarda Hospital for this patient admitted in ICU since the middle of August of this year, probably the cost effectiveness of this action has to be discussed between medical doctors, patients association, and administrators. And this is an heritage of COVID. And about this, we must fight with the same level of involvement we have and the same level of resistance and resilience we have had during the 2002 to 2021. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Pierluigi, for your very questions. Domande in italiano, c'è qualcuno? Torniamo alla lingua madre, la lingua di Dante. Cioè, no, tu non hai la domanda, stavi semplicemente parlando.
Vedo.
Ok.
Ho visto il professor un po'...
Quale?
Ho visto il professor Cortelli un po' preoccupato sulla storia che invecchiando aumentiamo il rischio di prendere il Covid.
Ma mica solo quello, perché lui da buon neurologo sa che cosa significa l'invecchiamento. Yeah, I'm joking. He's a neurologist, and they say the neurology they know very, very well what means aging, because there is a very simple issue. It's actually a pathology, but it's physiological. The shortening of the gray matter. It happens all the time when we get older, unfortunately. Sometimes more, sometimes less, but that's it. Ok, grazie allora a tutti, ringrazio il Presidente, professor Bolondi. Grazie ancora a tutti. Thank you very much.